For 100 years the spiral appeared only once every decade. Last week it appeared twice. Some patterns appear once. A coincidence. A strange event. Something unusual but explainable. But when the same pattern appears twice within a few days, people who study history begin to pay attention. 3 days after Captain Michael Carter altered course above the Rocky Mountains, another quiet decision took place nearly 2,000 miles away. Not in the sky. On the ground. Inside a small town that rarely appeared on maps outside its county. Pine Ridge. Eleanor Hayes arrived at the archive just before sunrise. The town was still quiet. Fog hung low along the courthouse square. The maple trees behind the archive barely moved in the early morning air. Inside the building, the shelves waited in their usual silence. But Eleanor no longer saw them as simple records. She saw them as coordinates. Points along a spiral that had been forming for more than a century. She turned on the desk lamp and looked again at the map on the wall. The newest pin marked the aviation event from 3 nights earlier. Flight 872. A storm dividing in the sky. Pressure redistributing. The spiral expanding beyond Pine Ridge. Eleanor traced the curve carefully with her finger. Then she noticed something strange. The spiral had always expanded outward slowly. Years between each event. Sometimes decades. But now 2 new points had appeared almost back to back. Which meant something unusual. Pressure was building faster. She whispered quietly. The system is accelerating. At that exact moment, the archive door opened. Eleanor turned. A man stepped inside. Plain coat. Dust on his boots. The same stranger who had appeared days earlier. He nodded politely. You noticed. Eleanor crossed her arms. The spiral expanded again. The man glanced toward the map. Yes. Eleanor studied his expression carefully. You said the spiral follows attention. Correct. She pointed toward the newest pin. A pilot noticed pressure forming in a storm. The man nodded. Captain Michael Carter. Eleanor blinked. You know him. The stranger smiled faintly. Not personally. But observers tend to notice each other eventually. Eleanor leaned against the desk. If the spiral usually takes years between events, why is it accelerating now? The man walked slowly toward the map. He studied the pins carefully. Then he spoke quietly. Because pressure has been building for a long time. Eleanor frowned. In storms. In systems. Weather. Human behavior. Decisions. He paused. When enough pressure accumulates, small choices start influencing larger outcomes more frequently. Eleanor glanced toward the journals. Which means the spiral will appear more often. The man nodded. Yes. Eleanor studied the map again. And eventually those events begin overlapping. The stranger turned toward her. You are beginning to understand. Far away in Minneapolis, Michael Carter sat inside a small aviation cafe reviewing weather charts. The brass compass rested beside his coffee cup. The spiral engraving caught the morning light. Michael had spent the previous night researching Harold Bennett's old flight reports. More examples appeared than he expected. Storms that shifted unexpectedly. Pressure redistributions. Flights that avoided severe turbulence moments before systems intensified. None of the reports mentioned spirals directly. But Michael had begun recognizing the pattern. A waitress refilled his coffee. You look like someone solving a puzzle, she said with a smile. Michael chuckled quietly. Something like that. He turned the compass again. Then something unusual happened. The compass needle trembled slightly. Michael frowned. There were no strong magnetic sources nearby. The needle should have remained steady. But it shifted briefly. Then settled again. North. Michael leaned closer. The spiral engraving seemed slightly darker than before. As if the metal had absorbed new light. He whispered quietly. Pressure shifting again. Outside the cafe window, clouds gathered slowly along the horizon. Not a storm. Not yet. Just the early signs of imbalance moving through the atmosphere. Michael opened his notebook. He drew the spiral again. Then he added another mark beside Flight 872. But something strange happened as he finished the drawing. His hand paused. He felt certain another point belonged on the spiral. Very close to the first. Which meant another moment had already occurred. Somewhere. Some decision. Some quiet act that had changed the balance of pressure again. Michael looked toward the sky outside the window. And far away in Pine Ridge, Eleanor Hayes was noticing the exact same thing. Because the spiral map on the archive wall had changed again. A second point had appeared. Not drawn. Not recorded in a report. But forming naturally between the existing pins. Eleanor stepped closer. Her voice lowered. There are two new curves. The stranger nodded. The spiral is tightening. Eleanor felt a quiet tension rising in the room. What happens when the spiral tightens? The stranger looked toward the archive shelves. Observers meet. The wind outside Pine Ridge shifted slightly. Not violently. Just enough to move the maple leaves across the courthouse square. And high above the continent, pressure currents moved quietly through the atmosphere. Two observers. One watching history. One watching the sky. Both standing along the same expanding curve. And the spiral had begun drawing them closer. Because when pressure gathers long enough, the world eventually brings its listeners together. In forgotten places where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. The spiral had changed again. Eleanor Hayes stood in front of the wall map inside the Pine Ridge archive, staring at the faint new curve that had appeared between the most recent pins. She had not drawn it. No new reports had arrived. Yet the pattern had shifted. The spiral was tightening. Behind her, the stranger watched quietly. The same calm expression. The same patience he carried every time he appeared. Eleanor finally spoke. You said observers eventually meet. The stranger nodded once. Yes. Eleanor crossed her arms. And you believe that pilot is one of them? Yes. She turned back toward the desk and opened the aviation report again. Flight 872. Storm system divided unexpectedly. Captain Michael Carter. The name now felt important. Not because of the flight itself. But because of the timing. The spiral had not expanded for years. Then suddenly 2 points appeared within days of each other. Something had accelerated the system. Eleanor looked toward the stranger again. What causes the spiral to tighten? The man walked slowly across the room, studying the shelves of records. Attention. Eleanor frowned. That is not very specific. The stranger paused beside one of the older document cabinets. When enough people begin noticing pressure, the system becomes more responsive. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. So awareness changes the pattern. The man nodded. Yes. He pulled open a drawer and removed an old aviation reference book. The cover showed signs of decades of use. He placed it gently on the desk. Your pilot was not the first. Eleanor opened the book slowly. Inside were archived aviation reports from the mid-20th century. Cargo flights. Weather incidents. Unexpected wind redistribution events. She turned several pages. Then she froze. The report was dated 1958. Cargo aircraft deviation. Storm. Cell divided unexpectedly. Pilot name, Harold Bennett. Eleanor whispered softly. The instructor. The stranger nodded. The one who carved the spiral into the compass. Eleanor looked up sharply. You know about the compass. The man smiled faintly. The spiral leaves reminders. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. So Harold Bennett recognized the pattern. Yes. And Michael Carter inherited the symbol. Yes. Eleanor flipped back through the aviation report again. Harold Bennett had flown through a similar atmospheric shift decades earlier. The storm had split. The aircraft passed safely between two pressure bands. Almost exactly like the recent event above the Rockies. She whispered quietly. The pattern repeated. The stranger corrected her gently. The pattern continued. Eleanor looked toward the spiral map again. Two observers separated by decades. Both noticing pressure shifts in storms. Both altering flight paths at the moment the system balanced itself. But the spiral map showed something more. Harold Bennett's event aligned with another point already marked in Pine Ridge history. A flood diversion recorded the same year. Two events. Different locations. Same curve on the spiral. Eleanor slowly turned toward the stranger. You are telling me the spiral does not follow geography? No. It follows balance. Eleanor considered that carefully. Which meant the spiral could appear anywhere. Storms. Rivers. Roads. Aircraft. Any system where pressure gathered long enough to require redistribution. She whispered the sentence from the journal again. Pressure gathers until someone listens. The stranger nodded. And sometimes more than one person listens. 1,000 miles away in Minneapolis, Michael Carter stared at the spiral drawing in his notebook. He had added 2 new marks during the past hour. One for Flight 872. Another for the earlier report from 1958. But something about the spacing bothered him. The spiral looked incomplete. As if another point should exist between the two. Michael opened the aviation database again. Searching older weather incidents. Storm redistributions. Unexpected pressure shifts. Then he noticed something unusual. The year 1958 appeared in more than one report. Not only aviation. River flooding. Transportation incidents. Weather anomalies. The pattern formed across multiple systems. Michael leaned back slowly. So it was not just the sky. The realization felt strangely familiar. As if someone had tried to explain it to him years earlier. Harold Bennett again. Michael remembered a conversation during a training flight long ago. The older instructor had once said something strange while watching a storm over the plains. The sky is only one layer of pressure, Harold had said. Michael had laughed at the time. But now the meaning seemed clearer. Weather. Water. Human systems. All interacting through pressure and balance. Michael picked up the brass compass again. The spiral engraving caught the light. He traced it with his finger. If this pattern is real, he whispered, someone must be recording it. And at that exact moment Eleanor Hayes turned another page inside the aviation archive book. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Not from the pilot. Not from the official report. A simple observation written later by someone studying the incident. The handwriting was careful. Deliberate. The note read, event corresponds with Pine Ridge Archive spiral pattern. Eleanor felt a quiet chill. Someone had connected the aviation event to Pine Ridge decades earlier. Someone had known the pattern extended beyond the town. She looked up at the stranger. You were right. The man nodded. There have always been observers. Eleanor whispered softly. And eventually they find each other. The stranger glanced toward the spiral map once more. Yes. He turned toward the door. But usually not before the spiral tightens. Outside the archive window, clouds gathered slowly across the western horizon. Not a storm yet. Just pressure moving through the atmosphere. Across the continent, the wind shifted gently above the plains. Two observers now recognized the same curve. One watching the sky. One watching history. And somewhere between them, the spiral continued drawing its quiet path forward. Because when pressure gathers long enough, balance eventually brings its listeners together. And the spiral always knows where they are. Patterns do not only exist in storms. They also exist in records. Quiet records. Documents stored for decades. Pages written by people who never expected anyone else would notice what they had seen. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Eleanor Hayes had begun understanding that the spiral was not simply a symbol. It was a record of balance. A record written slowly across time. She closed the aviation reference book carefully and looked toward the stranger again. You said there have always been observers. The stranger nodded. Yes. Eleanor gestured toward the shelves surrounding them. So someone here must have been recording the spiral long before I started working here. The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead he walked toward the far end of the archive. The section rarely used by visitors. Older cabinets. Documents that had not been opened for years. He stopped beside a narrow drawer near the floor. Then he looked back at Eleanor. Have you ever opened this one? Eleanor frowned slightly. She had organized most of the archive many times. But this cabinet was older than the rest. The label on the drawer had faded almost completely. She stepped closer. No. The stranger crouched and pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside lay a single large ledger. Bound in thick dark leather. Older than the journals that had arrived earlier in the week. The pages were heavy. The edges worn with age. Eleanor lifted the book carefully and placed it on the desk. She opened the cover. The first page held a title written in precise ink. Pressure Observations. Recorded for balance. Eleanor whispered softly. This was here the entire time. The stranger nodded. Yes. She turned the page. Inside were entries stretching back more than a century. Each entry described a moment when pressure had gathered in a system. A storm. A flood. A railway accident narrowly avoided. And beside each entry someone had drawn a spiral. Small. Precise. The same symbol she had seen in the journals. But this ledger contained something new. Names. Observers who had noticed each moment. Farmers. Railway engineers. Weather watchers. Pilots. Travelers. Archivists. People who had recognized pressure building before it broke. Eleanor scanned the most recent entries. Her voice lowered. They recorded Flight 872. The stranger nodded. Eleanor turned the page again. The entry was short. Storm system dividing after deviation. Observer, Michael Carter. She leaned back slowly. So the ledger updates itself. The stranger smiled faintly. No. Observers update it. Eleanor frowned. But no one has been writing here recently. The stranger looked toward the shelves around them. Someone always is. Eleanor studied the pages again. The last entry before the aviation event had been recorded 9 years earlier. A landslide avoided when a construction crew halted work after noticing unstable ground pressure. Observer, Daniel Mercer. Eleanor looked up. Where is he? The stranger shrugged slightly. Observers rarely stay in one place. She traced the spiral beside the entry again. Then she noticed something unusual near the bottom of the page. A second spiral. Much smaller. Incomplete. She looked toward the stranger. What does that mean? The man walked closer to the desk. It means the pressure has not fully balanced yet. Eleanor felt a quiet tension building in her chest. So another event is forming. The stranger nodded. Yes. She glanced toward the wall map. The spiral curve had tightened. 2 points within days. Now a third was beginning. Eleanor whispered softly. The system really is accelerating. The stranger spoke quietly. Pressure across many systems has been building for decades. Weather patterns. Infrastructure. Human behavior. When enough imbalance accumulates, the spiral begins appearing more frequently. Eleanor closed the ledger slowly. And observers begin finding each other. The stranger nodded. Exactly. Across the country, Michael Carter sat in the cockpit during pre-flight preparations for another departure. Minneapolis to Denver. Clear skies forecast. Routine flight. But Michael had been researching all morning. The spiral pattern continued appearing in historical aviation incidents. Storm redistributions. Unexpected turbulence avoidance. And one location kept appearing in the archive notes. Pine Ridge. The name appeared repeatedly in older meteorological observations connected to spiral events. Michael leaned back in his seat. Pine Ridge. He searched the map on his tablet. A small town. Barely visible among the surrounding counties. Population under 5,000. Nothing remarkable about it. Except one detail. A historical archive. Michael smiled faintly. Of course. Observers needed records. And records needed a place to live. He reached into his flight bag again. The brass compass rested in his hand. The spiral engraving caught the early sunlight streaming through the cockpit window. Michael whispered quietly. Someone there must know. The cabin crew finished boarding preparations. First Officer Ruiz stepped into the cockpit. Ready to go? Michael nodded. Almost. He glanced once more at the compass. Then toward the distant horizon beyond the airport runway. Pressure always moved before storms appeared. Which meant the spiral might already be forming again. And if Pine Ridge truly held the records of those moments, then sooner or later he would have to visit the town himself. Because patterns had a way of drawing observers toward the same place. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Eleanor Hayes closed the ledger and placed it beside the spiral journals. 3 records now sat together. The journals. The archive map. And the observer ledger. 3 different ways of describing the same quiet truth. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. Eleanor looked toward the stranger. How many observers are there? The man considered the question. Then he answered softly. Enough. Outside the archive window, wind moved gently across the courthouse square. Clouds drifted slowly above the town. Pressure shifting quietly across the atmosphere. And somewhere high above the continent, an aircraft lifted into the sky carrying a pilot who had begun following the same spiral that Eleanor Hayes had discovered inside the archive. 2 observers moving closer along the same curve. And the spiral had already begun preparing the moment when their paths would finally intersect. Because pressure does not only move through storms. It moves through people. And when enough pressure gathers, balance eventually brings its listeners together. Pressure rarely builds in a single place. It travels. Across air currents. Across rivers. Across human systems that most people never notice. And sometimes, when enough pressure gathers across many places at once, the world begins preparing a moment long before anyone understands what is happening. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Eleanor Hayes stared at the incomplete spiral drawn in the observer ledger. It had appeared beneath the most recent entry. A faint curve. Not yet a full symbol. Which meant something important. The moment had not finished unfolding. The stranger stood quietly beside the desk. Eleanor spoke softly. So the next event is already forming. The man nodded. Yes. She traced the partial spiral with her finger. Where? The stranger walked toward the wall map. The spiral of pins stretched across the continent now. Rivers. Storm systems. Transportation incidents. Aviation routes. Each event representing a moment when pressure had redistributed. He studied the outer edge of the spiral. Then he pointed toward the western curve. Here. Eleanor stepped closer. Her eyes followed the line. The curve pointed directly toward the Rocky Mountains. Near the same region where Flight 872 had altered course days earlier. Her voice lowered. Another storm? The stranger shook his head slightly. Not exactly. Eleanor frowned. What does that mean? The man spoke calmly. Storms do not appear instantly. They gather. Pressure builds slowly across the atmosphere before the clouds even begin forming. Eleanor looked toward the archive windows. The sky above Pine Ridge remained clear. But the spiral had never depended on what one town could see. She whispered softly. The system is preparing something. The stranger nodded. Yes. Several states away, Captain Michael Carter guided his aircraft smoothly across the high plains. Flight 349. Minneapolis to Denver. Cruising altitude. 37,000 feet. The passengers behind him were calm. Most had fallen asleep. The sky outside the cockpit windows appeared clear. But Michael was watching the radar differently now. Not just for storms. For pressure. He adjusted the radar sensitivity slightly. Thin bands of wind currents appeared on the screen. Curving gently. Almost invisible. But Michael recognized the shape immediately. A spiral beginning to form. He leaned closer. The pattern was incomplete. Pressure building across several hundred miles of atmosphere. First Officer Ruiz glanced at the screen. You seeing something? Michael nodded slowly. Maybe. Ruiz studied the radar. Looks like upper-level wind shear forming. Michael did not answer immediately. He had learned something during the past week. Pressure rarely built in isolation. It spread. Which meant the spiral forming on the radar might be connected to something happening far away. Ruiz spoke again. Weather control says no storms predicted. Michael smiled faintly. Storms usually appear after the pressure builds. Ruiz laughed softly. You have been thinking about storms a lot lately. Michael rested his hand briefly on the flight bag beside his seat. Inside the bag, the brass compass shifted slightly. The spiral engraving caught the cockpit light. Michael whispered quietly to himself. Where are you forming? Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Eleanor turned another page in the observer ledger. The partial spiral had grown darker. Not fully complete. But closer. She looked toward the stranger. The ledger is updating. The man nodded. The observers are responding. Eleanor frowned. What observers? The stranger pointed toward the aviation entry again. Your pilot. Eleanor felt a quiet realization forming. You mean he is noticing the pressure too? Yes. And his decisions will influence what happens next. The stranger nodded again. Possibly. Eleanor crossed her arms. So the spiral is not predicting the future. No. It records the moment when the system balances. Eleanor glanced back toward the wall map. The outer curve now pointed toward the western sky. Toward the same region where Michael Carter was flying. She whispered softly. So the next moment could involve him again. The stranger did not deny it. High above the plains, the wind current strengthened slightly. Michael watched the radar carefully. The spiral pattern expanded. Not violently. Just enough to reveal its shape more clearly. Pressure was gathering across the atmosphere. But something unusual caught his attention. The spiral did not appear centered on the storm forming ahead. It appeared centered slightly east of the developing system. Michael studied the coordinates carefully. The center point aligned almost exactly with a small town in Colorado. He opened the navigation map. The town name appeared. Pine Ridge. Michael leaned back slowly. That name again. The same location appearing repeatedly in the aviation reports he had studied earlier. Ruiz noticed the change in his expression. "You all right?" Michael nodded. "Just noticing something interesting." Ruiz glanced at the map. "Small town." Michael nodded. "But somehow connected to a lot of pressure patterns." Ruiz chuckled. "You sound like a meteorologist now." Michael smiled slightly. "Maybe storms have stories too." Back in Pine Ridge, Eleanor stepped outside the archive as evening clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Wind moved gently through the courthouse square. Not a storm yet. But the air felt different. Charged. The stranger stood beside her. They both looked toward the western horizon. Eleanor spoke quietly. "If the spiral tightens any further." The stranger finished the sentence. "The observers will meet." Eleanor glanced back toward the archive door. Inside the building, the ledger waited on the desk. The incomplete spiral still forming on its final page. High above the continent, Michael Carter adjusted his radar once more. The spiral pattern was almost complete now. Pressure gathering across multiple systems. And both observers understood something the rest of the world did not yet see. The moment was approaching. The moment when pressure would finally balance again. Because when the spiral tightens enough, the system does not simply redistribute force. It brings the people who noticed it together. And somewhere between the sky and the ground, the next curve of the spiral was about to close. Some moments arrive quietly. Not with thunder. Not with warning. Just a small shift in balance. A slight change in direction. The kind of moment most people never notice. But observers recognize them immediately. Because the spiral always tightens just before the system finds balance again. High above the Rocky Mountains, Captain Michael Carter watched the radar carefully. The faint spiral pattern forming across the wind currents had almost completed its curve. Pressure was redistributing across hundreds of miles of atmosphere. Still no storm. Not yet. But the imbalance was clear. First Officer Ruiz glanced at the screen again. "You still watching that pressure band?" Michael nodded. "It is getting stronger." Ruiz checked the meteorological report. "They still say clear skies." Michael smiled slightly. "Storms usually appear after pressure gathers." He adjusted the radar again. The spiral expanded slightly. Then something unexpected happened. The center of the spiral moved. Not dramatically. Just a small shift east. Directly toward the same location Michael had noticed earlier. Pine Ridge. Michael leaned forward. The spiral was aligning itself over the region like a slow-turning compass. He reached into his flight bag and removed the brass instrument again. The spiral engraving caught the cockpit light. For a moment he imagined Harold Bennett standing beside him again. Watching the radar. Waiting for the same signal. Michael whispered quietly. "You saw this before." Outside the cockpit windows, clouds began forming along the distant horizon. Thin layers at first. Barely visible. The early architecture of a storm. Ruiz spoke again. "If that system grows, we might need a deviation." Michael nodded slowly. But he did not change course yet. Not until the pressure finished moving. Because now he understood something Harold Bennett had tried to explain years earlier. The spiral does not force decisions. It reveals the moment when decisions matter. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Eleanor Hayes stood beside the open ledger. The incomplete spiral on the final page had grown darker. Another curve had appeared during the past hour. She looked toward the stranger. "It is almost finished." The man nodded calmly. "Yes." Eleanor glanced toward the wall map again. The spiral pins now pointed directly toward the western mountains. Exactly where the aviation pressure system was forming. Her voice lowered. "The pilot is inside the spiral again." The stranger smiled faintly. "He is listening." Eleanor traced the partial spiral in the ledger once more. "What happens when it closes?" The man answered quietly. "The system balances." She waited. "And the observers meet." Eleanor felt a quiet tension rise in the room. So this time the spiral is not just redistributing a storm. No. It is redistributing attention. High above the mountains, the wind currents shifted suddenly. The radar image changed. The spiral tightened one final time. Then the pressure bands separated. Not violently. Just enough to redirect the airflow across the region. The developing storm weakened. Cloud formations stretched apart. The atmosphere stabilized. Ruiz blinked at the radar. That system just collapsed. Michael nodded quietly. The spiral had closed. The pressure had balanced. But something else had happened too. The center of the spiral now aligned almost exactly with Pine Ridge. Michael looked down at the navigation display. The town sat just east of their current route. Only a minor deviation away. He pressed the radio switch. Requesting 10-degree course adjustment east for weather observation. Air traffic control responded after a short pause. Deviation approved. The aircraft banked gently. Passengers barely noticed the change. But the spiral on the radar faded slowly as the system stabilized. Michael felt a strange certainty settle into his thoughts. The pressure had not only balanced the atmosphere. It had drawn him toward the center of the pattern. Toward the place where the spiral had been recorded for more than a century. Pine Ridge. Inside the archive, Eleanor watched the final curve appear on the ledger page. The spiral was complete. She exhaled slowly. It finished. The stranger nodded. The pressure balanced. Eleanor looked toward the map again. The spiral curve now pointed directly toward the sky above Pine Ridge. She whispered softly. The center moved. Yes. Toward here. The stranger walked toward the archive door. He paused before leaving. Observers rarely realize they are part of the pattern. Eleanor looked up. But eventually the spiral brings them together. She stepped toward the window. Clouds drifted slowly above the courthouse square. The wind moved softly through the maple leaves. Nothing dramatic. Nothing violent. Just the quiet balance that followed pressure. Far above the town, the distant sound of an aircraft echoed faintly through the evening air. Eleanor looked up toward the sky. Somewhere beyond the clouds, a pilot who had been following the spiral was passing overhead. Neither of them had met yet. But the spiral had already begun closing the distance between their paths. Because patterns have a way of guiding observers toward the same place. And when the spiral tightens enough, the moment of intersection becomes unavoidable. In forgotten places where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to whispers of reckoning. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And sometimes the people who listen discover they have been walking along the same spiral all along. Every act leaves an echo.